The expensive crystal glass in my hand trembled as I watched my sister take a deep breath to blow out the candles on her massive birthday cake, while everyone in our backyard fell into a temporary, expectant silence. I am Arianna, a 26-year-old risk analyst who has spent the last decade quietly fixing the financial disasters of my family while staying deep in the shadows of their constant admiration for my older sibling. As the smoke from the candles drifted upward, Cheyenne looked directly into my eyes and screamed that she wished I would die so she could finally be the only child and have everything to herself. My heart physically constricted in my chest. Yet the most agonizing part was not her cruelty, but the fact that our parents immediately burst out laughing as if she had just delivered the most hilarious joke of the evening. My father patted her on the back, while my mother wiped a tear of laughter from her eye, neither of them noticing that I was standing there like a ghost at my own emotional execution. I did not scream or cry because I realized in that precise moment that my years of silent sacrifice had earned me nothing but a front-row seat to my own family's hatred. I quietly set my drink down on the marble table and walked toward the exit without saying a single word, knowing that by tomorrow morning the financial safety net I had built for them would vanish forever. Before we dive deeper into how I dismantled their lives piece by piece, please tell me what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you love stories about standing up to toxic people and taking back your power, make sure to hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell to support my journey. Don't forget to drop a comment below because your engagement helps me share these life lessons with more people around the world. Growing up in a household where the sun rose and set according to the whims of my sister meant that I learned to navigate the world as an invisible observer from a very young age. My father Clarence and my mother Doris treated Cheyenne as though she were a fragile porcelain doll whose every desire was a command that the rest of us were obligated to fulfill without question or hesitation. While Cheyenne was showered with expensive extracurricular activities and the latest fashion trends, I was often reminded that my needs had to be secondary because the family resources were supposedly limited at that particular moment. I vividly remember how Cheyenne would intentionally break my favorite toys just to see if our parents would discipline her, but Mom would only tell me that I was the strong one who needed to learn how to share more gracefully. My childhood was defined by a series of quiet concessions where I handed over my achievements to provide a backdrop for her theatrical displays of entitlement and vanity. When I worked 3 part-time jobs during college to pay for my own tuition and textbooks, Dad would praise Cheyenne for her social networking skills while she spent their retirement savings on weekend trips to Cabo. They viewed my independence not as a source of pride, but as a convenient excuse to ignore me entirely because they knew I would never be the one causing a scene or demanding a bailout. This dynamic created a toxic environment where my worth was measured solely by how little trouble I caused, whereas Cheyenne's value was reaffirmed every time she made a spectacular mess of her life. My parents developed a habit of masking their blatant favoritism with a layer of condescending humor that frequently targeted my serious nature and my commitment to my career in finance. They would often joke during family dinners that I was the boring accountant of the family, while Cheyenne was the vibrant soul who truly knew how to live life to its absolute fullest extent. I spent years convincing myself that if I just worked harder and became more successful, they would eventually see that I was the one actually holding the foundation of our family together. Instead, my success only made me a more attractive target for their exploitation whenever Cheyenne's reckless choices finally caught up with her carefully curated public image. The psychological toll of being the designated martyr for a family that didn't even like me began to erode my sense of self, leaving me with a cold determination to survive their neglect. I watched as Cheyenne navigated her early 20s with a terrifying lack of accountability because she knew that mom and dad would always be there to catch her whenever she fell. They created a monster who believed the world owed her everything, and they expected me to be the one who quietly funded the lifestyle that sustained that delusion. Every time I tried to establish a boundary, my parents would use guilt as a weapon, accusing me of being cold-hearted or jealous of my sister's supposed charisma and natural beauty. I was trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse where my only role was to be the silent provider who asked for nothing while giving everything, until there was nothing left but resentment. Cheyenne once told me to my face that I was born to serve her, and when I reported this to Doris, my mother merely laughed and said that Cheyenne always had such a vivid and creative imagination. That lack of protection from the people who were supposed to love me most was the original wound that never truly healed, even as I built a successful life outside their reach. I realized that my parents didn't love Cheyenne for who she was, but rather for the reflection of the glamorous life they wished they had lived themselves through her. I was the inconvenient reminder of reality, the one who talked about budget savings and the consequences of actions that they desperately wanted to avoid at all costs. As Cheyenne grew older, her demands became more sophisticated, and her manipulation of our parents reached a level of artistry that was both impressive and deeply disturbing to witness. She learned that she could get whatever she wanted by staging emotional breakdowns that sent Clarence and Doris into a state of panicked desperation to please her. I became the unwilling witness to their slow financial suicide as they drained their accounts to keep up with the image Cheyenne wanted to project to her social media followers. The more I succeeded in my professional life, the more they felt entitled to my earnings, as if my hard work was merely a collective family asset that belonged to Cheyenne as much as it did to me. I was never invited to share in their joy, only to participate in their crises, and even then I was expected to do so without expecting a single word of gratitude in return. This pervasive sense of injustice was the backdrop of my entire existence, a long-term strategy of marginalization that made the events of the birthday party not an isolated incident, but the logical conclusion of their cruelty. I spent 26 years waiting for a sign that I mattered to them as something more than a safety net or a backup plan for their favored child. The laughter that echoed through the garden after Cheyenne's death wish was the final piece of evidence I needed to confirm that my family was a sinking ship I no longer wanted to save. 2 years before that fateful night in the Hamptons, my life was interrupted by a desperate phone call from my mother that would ultimately tie my financial future to Cheyenne's destruction. Doris was sobbing so uncontrollably that I initially thought someone had been seriously injured in a car accident or a violent crime, but the reality was far more mundane yet equally devastating for our family's reputation. My sister had managed to accumulate over $45,000 in high-interest credit card debt while attempting to launch a failed lifestyle brand that nobody actually asked for or wanted to follow. Cheyenne had been living in a luxury apartment she couldn't afford and purchasing designer wardrobes on credit, assuming that the fame she craved would eventually pay for all her excessive indulgences. When the collection agencies began calling our parents' house and threatening to sue Clarence and Doris realized that their own credit scores were not enough to secure a consolidation loan to save their home from a potential lien. They turned to me with a level of artificial affection that nauseated me, begging me to act as a co-signer for a massive loan that would theoretically put all of Cheyenne's debts into one manageable monthly payment. I resisted at first because my professional training as a risk analyst warned me that Cheyenne was the ultimate liability who had no intention of actually changing her spending habits. My father sat me down in his study and told me that if I didn't help, the family home where I grew up would be lost to the bank because they had used it as collateral for Cheyenne's previous mistakes. The pressure was immense, with my mother crying about how Cheyenne was fragile and would surely do something drastic to herself if she were forced to face the harsh reality of her bankruptcy. I foolishly allowed my lingering desire for their approval to cloud my judgment, and I signed the legal documents that made me a secondary debtor for $45,000 plus interest. At the time, I made Cheyenne sign a private agreement stating that she would pay the monthly installments directly to the bank, believing that a written contract would provide me with some level of protection. However, within 3 months of the loan being finalized, Cheyenne stopped making payments entirely and used the extra cash flow to fund a lavish trip to Paris with her equally shallow friends. When I confronted her about the missed payments, she laughed in my face and told me that since I was the one with the high-paying bank job, I should be the one to handle the responsibility of the debt. My parents sided with her, immediately arguing that I was being petty about money when my sister was finally finding herself and exploring the world like a true artist should. I found myself forced to pay nearly $800 every month out of my own salary just to keep my own credit score from being destroyed by her deliberate negligence. I realized then that I wasn't just helping my sister. I was actively subsidizing her ability to disrespect me while my parents cheered her on from the sidelines. Every dollar I sent to that bank was a dollar taken away from the house I wanted to buy, or the wedding I was planning with Silas, who was increasingly horrified by my family's behavior. I began to keep a meticulous record of every cent I spent on Cheyenne, including the times I paid for her car insurance and the legal fees associated with her multiple traffic violations. I sat in my office late at night staring at spreadsheets that detailed exactly how much of my life was being drained away to maintain the illusion of Cheyenne's success. My father would call me not to ask how I was doing, but to remind me that the loan payment was due, and that I shouldn't be late because it might stress Doris out. They treated my financial contribution as an atmospheric condition, something that was just supposed to be there without them ever having to acknowledge its source or its cost to me. Cheyenne would post photos of her new designer shoes on Instagram, and I would receive a notification from my bank that my account was low because I had just covered her latest mistake. This went on for 2 agonizing years, during which I became the silent architect of their continued survival, while they treated me like a cold and calculating outsider. I watched as Cheyenne's entitlement grew in direct proportion to the amount of my money she consumed, and I saw my parents' gratitude turn into an expectation of perpetual service. They truly believed that because I was capable and responsible, it was my divine purpose to carry the weight of Cheyenne's incompetence for the rest of my natural life. I began to feel like a prisoner in my own success, knowing that every promotion I earned would only result in a higher demand for financial support from my ungrateful relatives. Silas warned me that this situation was unsustainable and that my family would eventually bleed me dry if I didn't find a way to sever the legal ties that bound us together. I started preparing for a contingency plan, working with a colleague in the legal department to understand the exact steps required to withdraw my support without destroying my own career. I knew that the moment I stopped the flow of money, the thin veneer of family unity would shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces that would likely cut me on the way out. Yet I continued to pay, waiting for a moment of clarity or a sign that perhaps they might actually value me for something other than my bank account. The irony of being a risk analyst who was knowingly maintaining the highest risk investment of her life was not lost on me as I signed check after check. I was buying their silence and their temporary peace, but in reality I was only delaying the inevitable explosion that was coming for all of us. Cheyenne's behavior became increasingly erratic as she realized that there were no consequences for her actions as long as I was there to clean up the aftermath of her frequent disasters. She began to treat me with a level of open hostility that was intended to keep me in my place, ensuring that I never felt superior just because I was the one paying the bills. My parents encouraged this dynamic, often telling me that I should be more like Cheyenne and learn how to have a little more fun instead of being so obsessed with numbers and long-term security. They were living in a house of cards that I had built for them, and they were spent their days throwing stones at the only person holding the walls up. 1 year before the disastrous birthday party, I found myself sitting in a dimly lit corner of a local bistro with my closest friend Riley, who had been watching my family's descent into madness with a mixture of pity and rage. Riley worked as a digital security consultant, and she was the first person to notice a series of strange inquiries on my credit report that didn't align with my personal spending or my professional activities. She laid out a folder of documents on the table and explained that someone had been using my personal information to open several secondary credit cards under my name without my explicit authorization. It didn't take a genius to realize that Cheyenne had stolen my social security number from my parents' filing cabinet and was now using my hard-earned credit rating to fund a secret life of luxury. Riley warned me that this was not just a family dispute anymore. It was identity theft and a serious crime that could land Cheyenne in prison if I chose to report it to the authorities. I felt a cold wave of betrayal wash over me as I realized that my own sister had not only taken my money, but was now actively sabotaging my future to buy things she didn't need. When I confronted Cheyenne at our parents' house that weekend, she didn't even have the decency to look ashamed or try to deny what she had done to me. She told me that since we were sisters, everything I owned was technically hers too, and that I was being incredibly selfish for hoarding my good credit while she was struggling to build her brand. My mother walked into the room and immediately took Cheyenne's side, claiming that I was being overly dramatic and that families should always share their resources to help each other succeed. Doris actually had the audacity to suggest that I should be happy my credit was being used for something as glamorous as Cheyenne's fashion career, instead of just sitting there doing nothing. My father, Clarence, simply looked up from his newspaper and told me to stop bothering my sister with my accounting nonsense because it was giving him a headache on his day off. I stood there in total disbelief as I realized that my parents were not just enabling Cheyenne's behavior, they were actively encouraging her to steal from me to maintain their collective delusion of wealth. Riley told me that night that I was being treated like a sacrificial lamb, and that if I didn't act soon, Cheyenne would eventually commit a fraud so large that it would bankrupt me permanently. I spent the next several months working secretly with a lawyer to freeze my credit and gather evidence of every unauthorized transaction Cheyenne had made using my identity. I discovered that she had spent over $12,000 on designer handbags, high-end skincare, and a down payment for a luxury car lease that was now in my name. The sheer scale of her deception was breathtaking, and yet every time I saw her at family gatherings, she would treat me with a level of condescension that suggested I was beneath her social status. She would brag to our aunts and uncles about how well her business was doing conveniently, forgetting to mention that every cent of her success was actually my stolen equity. My parents would beam with pride as they told everyone how Cheyenne was a natural-born entrepreneur, while they ignored me when I tried to talk about my recent promotion at the bank. I felt like I was living in an alternate reality where honesty and hard work were punished, while theft and manipulation were rewarded with unconditional love and public praise. Riley stayed by my side during those dark months, helping me secure my accounts and providing the emotional support that my own family had withheld from me for my entire life. She was the one who reminded me that I wasn't the boring one. I was the responsible one who deserved a life free from the parasitic demands of people who didn't respect my existence. I began to distance myself from the family, only showing up for major events to avoid the inevitable drama that would follow if I went completely silent. Cheyenne noticed my withdrawal and interpreted it as a sign of weakness, stepping up her verbal attacks and mocking me for being unstable and obsessed with money. She told our relatives that I was jealous of her beauty and her social standing, and that I was trying to sabotage her career out of spite because I was unhappy in my own life. My parents believed every word she said, or at least they found it easier to believe her lies than to confront the fact that their favorite child was a common criminal. I realized that the only reason they wanted me around was to ensure that I would continue to be the safety net for the inevitable moment when Cheyenne's house of cards finally collapsed. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted an insurance policy that they could insult and belittle whenever they felt like it. Silas wanted me to go to the police immediately, but I was still held back by a lingering sense of duty to my parents who were getting older and clearly couldn't handle the truth. I decided to wait for a moment where I could make a clean break that would protect me legally, while also forcing them to see Cheyenne for exactly who she was. I didn't realize that the opportunity would present itself in the most public and humiliating way possible at Cheyenne's 31st birthday party. I spent that year living a double life, acting as the dutiful daughter on the surface, while building a fortress around my finances that no one in my family could penetrate. Every time I looked at Cheyenne, I saw a predator who was waiting for the next chance to strike, and I saw my parents as her willing accomplices. The betrayal felt like a heavy weight in my chest that I carried every single day, making it difficult to trust anyone outside of Silas and Riley. I learned to hide my emotions behind a professional mask, a skill I had perfected at the bank, but was now using to survive my own home life. I was no longer the girl who wanted her parents' love. I was a woman who was preparing for a war that she knew she would eventually have to win alone. The night of the birthday party began with an oppressive humidity that seemed to hang over the manicured lawn of our parents' Hamptons estate, like a physical warning of the storm to come. My parents had spent an exorbitant amount of money on a catering team and a live band to celebrate Cheyenne's 31st year in age, where most adults are expected to be self-sufficient and mature. I stood near the bar with Silas watching as Cheyenne held court among her friends wearing a dress that I knew had been purchased with a credit card I was currently struggling to pay off. She didn't acknowledge my presence for the first 2 hours of the party except to send a server over to tell me that I was standing in a way that ruined the aesthetic of her photos. My mother Doris was fluttering around like a social butterfly, telling everyone how proud she was of Cheyenne's latest creative ventures, while my father Clarence bragged about the cost of the imported champagne. Neither of them had mentioned that I had just received a national award for my work in financial risk management the previous week, as if my real achievements were an embarrassment compared to Cheyenne's imagined ones. Silas squeezed my hand and whispered that we could leave whenever I wanted, but I felt a strange compulsion to stay and see just how far they would push the boundaries of my endurance. When it came time for the cake, the crowd gathered around the large table decorated with white roses and expensive candles that cost more than my first car's monthly payment. Cheyenne stood behind the cake with a smug expression, looking like a queen, who was about to receive the ultimate tribute from her devoted subjects. She made a long, rambling speech about how difficult her journey as a visionary had been, and how she was finally ready to claim everything that she deserved from the world. My parents stood on either side of her, their faces glowing with a sickening level of adoration that they had never once directed toward me in my 26 years. After she blew out the candles, the backyard fell into a hush, and that was when she leaned forward and made her declaration about wishing I would no longer exist. The words were sharp and deliberate, designed to cut through the festive atmosphere and remind me that in her perfect world I was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. I waited for the gasps of horror from the guests, for my father to demand an apology, or for my mother to at least look uncomfortable with such a public display of malice. Instead, the air was filled with the sound of my parents' laughter, a high-pitched and genuine sound that felt like a series of physical blows to my stomach. Doris leaned over and kissed Cheyenne's cheek, telling her that she was always so hilariously blunt, and that everyone knew she was just joking about her sibling rivalry. Clarence laughed so hard that he had to set his glass down, telling the guests that his daughters were always competing for the spotlight, in their own funny little way. The 40 guests took their cue from my parents and began to chuckle along, turning my existential humiliation into a shared piece of entertainment for the wealthy elite. I looked around at the faces of people I had known my entire life, and I realized that none of them saw me as a human being with feelings that could be hurt. I was just the stable sister, the one who didn't matter because I was expected to be the adult in the room who could take any amount of abuse without flinching. The laughter felt like it was echoing in a tunnel, growing louder and more distorted until it was the only thing I could hear in the entire world. I looked at Silas, and the look of pure, unadulterated rage on his face was the only thing that kept me from crumbling into the grass right then and there. I didn't say anything to Cheyenne, and I didn't try to defend myself against her cruelty, because I knew that words were no longer enough to address the rot at the core of my family. I realized that my parents were not just laughing at a joke. They were laughing at the very idea that my life had any intrinsic value outside of what I could provide for them. My mother caught my eye for a brief second and gave me a dismissive wave as if to tell me to stop being so sensitive and just enjoy the party like everyone else. That wave was the final straw that broke the last remaining bond of loyalty I felt toward the woman who had given me life, but had never truly given me love. I reached into my purse, pulled out my car keys, and started walking toward the driveway with a steady pace that didn't falter even when my father called out my name to ask where I was going with the extra wine. I didn't look back to see the confusion on their faces or the smug triumph on Cheyenne's, because I was already mentally calculating the steps required to dismantle their reality. Every step away from that backyard felt like I was shedding a layer of a heavy, suffocating skin that I had been forced to wear for far too long. I knew that by leaving without a word, I was violating their code of conduct, which required me to always stay and be the punching bag for their collective amusement. I got into my car and sat in the silence for a moment, feeling the adrenaline start to replace the numbness that had settled into my bones during the party. Silas got in beside me and asked me if I was okay, and I told him that for the first time in my life I was actually more than okay. I was finished with being the martyr, and I was ready to become the consequence that they had spent decades trying to avoid. As we drove away from the Hamptons estate, I saw the lights of the party fading in the rearview mirror, and I knew that the version of me they thought they could control was gone forever. They wanted a world where I didn't exist, and I was more than happy to give them exactly what they wished for, but on my own terms. Sang thu hai jiao tuan hitia nang samnat shua kipcham, tuin hung o kua kin kua van fong, luat sutai Manhattan toijan goi santrong fong hop, voi mot chong ho, so de jak chung ko. My lawyer, Mr. Bennett, had been preparing for this day for months, but even he was surprised by the cold precision with which I instructed him to proceed with the legal separation of my finances. I spent the first 3 hours of the morning signing documents that officially withdrew my co-signature from the consolidation loan, a move that was only possible because I had documented Cheyenne's breach of our private payment contract. I also filed a formal report of identity theft and credit card fraud against my sister, providing the police with the evidence Riley and I had meticulously gathered over the past year. By 10 o'clock in the morning, I had authorized the bank to freeze the accounts that were being used to pay for our parents' mortgage, as those funds were technically coming from a line of credit that was solely in my name. I felt a strange sense of calm as I executed each step, knowing that I was effectively pulling the rug out from under a family that had spent their lives dancing on my head. I didn't stop there. I composed a detailed email addressed to my parents, my sister, and every member of our extended family who had been at the party on Saturday night. In that email, I attached the spreadsheets of Cheyenne's debts, the receipts for the thousands of dollars I had paid on her behalf, and the legal notices of the fraud investigation I had just initiated. I wrote that since my presence in the family was apparently a source of such misery that my sister wished for my death, and my parents found it hilarious, I had decided to grant their wish and disappear from their financial lives entirely. I stated clearly that as of that moment I would no longer be responsible for a single cent of their expenses, their debts, or their lifestyle, and that any further contact would have to go through Mr. Bennett. I hit the send button and then immediately turned off my personal phone, choosing to spend the rest of the day immersed in the complex data of my work at the bank. I knew that the moment they read that email, the laughter in the Hamptons would be replaced by a frantic, desperate screaming that would echo through their empty house. My mother would likely try to call me hundreds of times to tell me that I was being cruel and that family should always forgive, but she would find only a busy signal and a wall of legal silence. My father would realize that the mortgage he hadn't worried about for years was now his sole responsibility, and that he had no savings left because he had spent them all on Cheyenne's whims. I felt a wave of professional satisfaction in knowing that I had handled the situation with the same analytical rigor I applied to a failing hedge fund or a high-risk loan portfolio. I wasn't acting out of a desire for revenge. I was simply rebalancing the ledger and removing a toxic asset from my life to protect my own long-term stability. Silas met me for lunch and told me that the news was already spreading through the family grapevine, with Aunt Beverly and Uncle Gerald calling him to ask what on earth was going on. I told him to tell them exactly what Cheyenne had wished for and how our parents had reacted, and to let them draw their own conclusions about where the true cruelty lay. I realized that for years I had been protecting their reputations at the cost of my own sanity, and now I was finally letting the truth be the judge and jury of their actions. The realization that Cheyenne would now have to face a criminal investigation for her identity theft was the most satisfying part of the day, as it was a consequence she could not charm or manipulate her way out of. She had spent her life believing she was above the law, because Clarence and Doris had always played the role of her personal defense attorneys, but they had no power in a federal fraud case. I spent the afternoon at my desk feeling lighter with every passing hour, as if I had finally dropped a heavy backpack I had been carrying since I was a small child. I knew that the fallout from my decision would be catastrophic for them, but I also knew that I was not the one who had caused the catastrophe. I was simply the one who stopped preventing it from happening. My parents had made a choice to value a fantasy over the reality of their responsible daughter, and now they were going to have to live with the consequences of that choice in a world that didn't care about their excuses. I was no longer interested in their explanations or their apologies, because I had seen their true hearts in the glow of the birthday candles and the sound of their laughter. I had spent 26 years trying to be the perfect daughter, and now I was going to spend the rest of my life being the woman who knew her own worth and refused to let anyone diminish it. I had built a fortress around my life that no amount of their guilt or manipulation could penetrate, and I felt a profound sense of peace in the middle of the storm I had created. I was finally free from the burden of their expectations and the constant drain of their entitlement, and I was ready to see what my life could look like when I was the only person I had to take care of. 3 weeks after I sent that final email, the consequences of my family's choices began to manifest in a series of brutal and public failures that they were completely unprepared to handle. The bank had moved with surprising speed to initiate the foreclosure process on the Hamptons estate, because my father had failed to make the first mortgage payment in nearly a decade without my assistance. My mother, Doris, had been forced to return almost all of the designer items she had purchased for Cheyenne's birthday, but the stores had refused to give her a full refund due to the items being used and the tags being removed. I heard through the family grapevine that Cheyenne had been officially questioned by the police regarding the identity theft charges, and that her social media sponsors had dropped her the moment the news of the investigation leaked to the local press. My father had tried to find a job in his old industry, but he quickly realized that his skills were 20 years out of date, and that no one wanted to hire a 60-year-old man with a reputation for being difficult and entitled. They were living in a house that was no longer theirs, surrounded by the remnants of a lifestyle they could no longer afford, and they were finally feeling the cold reality of the world they had ignored for so long. My personal phone remained off, but Silas would occasionally show me the voicemails that my parents were leaving on his office line, each one more desperate and manipulative than the last. At first, the messages were angry and full of accusations, with my mother screaming that I was a monster who was trying to kill her parents by making them homeless in their old age. Then the tone shifted to a pathetic kind of begging, with my father crying about how he was sorry for the misunderstanding at the party and that they were willing to do anything to make it right. Cheyenne even left a message, her voice trembling with a fake kind of humility, as she asked if I could at least help her pay for a lawyer so she wouldn't have to go to jail for a few little mistakes. I listened to these messages with a sense of detachment, feeling as though I were listening to characters in a tragedy that I had already finished reading and put back on the shelf. The most shocking moment came when my mother somehow found out where I was staying and showed up at the lobby of my apartment building looking disheveled and frantic in a way I had never seen her before. She tried to push past the doorman screaming my name and telling everyone who would listen that I was a heartless daughter who was abandoning her family in their hour of greatest need. When I finally agreed to speak to her for 5 minutes in a nearby coffee shop, she didn't even ask how I was doing or try to apologize for the laughter at the party. Instead, she immediately pulled out a stack of bills and told me that I needed to pay them immediately, or they would lose their car and their health insurance by the end of the week. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like an inconvenience, and I realized that she still didn't see me as a person. I was still just a financial resource to be exploited. I told her that I had already given them 26 years of my life and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that my account was now permanently closed to them. Her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred, and she told me that she wished she had never had me, that Cheyenne was the only daughter she ever truly wanted. I smiled at her, a cold and genuine smile, and told her that her wish had finally come true, because as of that moment, I no longer considered myself her daughter in any sense of the word. I walked out of that coffee shop and watched through the window as she broke down into a fit of ugly, performative sobbing that no longer had any power over my heart or my bank account. A few days later, I received a formal notice that the foreclosure was complete and that my parents had 48 hours to vacate the property before the sheriff arrived to remove them and their belongings. They had nowhere to go because they had alienated all of their friends with their arrogance and their constant requests for money to support Cheyenne's lifestyle. My sister was facing a trial that would likely result in several years of probation and a permanent criminal record that would prevent her from ever working in the luxury industry again. The perfect life they had built on the foundation of my labor was gone, replaced by a harsh and unforgiving reality that they had no tools to navigate. I felt a brief moment of sadness for the parents they could have been if they hadn't chosen to be enablers, but that sadness was quickly replaced by the overwhelming relief of my own freedom. I was no longer waiting for the next crisis or the next insult, because I had removed the audience for their drama and the funding for their delusions. They were now just three people who had to learn how to survive in a world that didn't care about their past status or their excuses for their own incompetence. I realized that by forcing them to face the consequences of their actions, I was giving them the only thing they had ever truly lacked: the truth. Whether they chose to learn from it or to drown in their own resentment was no longer my responsibility, and that was the greatest gift I had ever given to myself. 6 months have passed since the day I walked out of the coffee shop and chose to never look back at the wreckage of the family I once tried so hard to save. I am now living in a beautiful, quiet town in a different state where nobody knows me as the boring sister or the person who exists solely to pay for someone else's mistakes. Silas and I recently bought our first home together, a place filled with light and a sense of peace that I never thought I would be allowed to experience in my own life. My career has continued to flourish because I am no longer drained by the constant emotional and financial demands of people who only saw me as a means to an end. My grandmother Mildred contacted me a few weeks ago to tell me that she had officially removed Cheyenne and my parents from her will, choosing instead to set up a trust for me and any future children I might have. She told me that she had watched the way they treated me for years and was proud of me for finally having the courage to stand up for my own worth and my own future. My parents and Cheyenne are now living in a small, cramped apartment in a part of the city they used to mock, struggling to make ends meet with low-wage jobs that they are barely qualified to perform. Cheyenne is working as a part-time receptionist while she deals with the ongoing requirements of her probation, and her social media accounts have been deleted out of shame and a lack of resources to maintain her fake image. My father and mother are constantly bickering about money, finally realizing that the daughter they laughed at was the only thing standing between them and the poverty they now inhabit every single day. They still try to send me messages through distant relatives claiming that they have changed and that they miss me, but I know that they only miss the comfort and security I provided. I have no desire for an apology that is only being offered because the money ran out, and I have no interest in a relationship that was built on a foundation of exploitation and neglect. The most important lesson I have learned through this entire journey is that shared DNA does not constitute a family. Only mutual respect and genuine love can do that. When your family treats your pain as a joke and your sacrifices as an obligation, you are not being strong by staying, you are merely participating in your own destruction. Leaving was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was also the only way to save the person I was meant to be before I was crushed by their entitlement. I now wake up every morning in a house where my achievements are celebrated. My boundaries are respected and my presence is valued for who I am not, for what I can give. I have surrounded myself with a chosen family of people who would never dream of wishing for my death or laughing at my humiliation for the sake of a cheap joke. I look back at the girl who stood in that backyard in the Hamptons, and I feel a profound sense of gratitude for her silence, because that silence was the beginning of her power. I am no longer the invisible daughter. I am a woman who has built a life on her own terms, and I will never again apologize for my success or my refusal to be a martyr. Thank you for listening to my story and for walking with me through the darkest chapters of my life until we reach the light of this new beginning. If you have ever felt like you were the only one holding your world together while being treated like you didn't matter, I hope my journey gives you the courage to choose yourself. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, because I would love to hear your perspectives on setting boundaries and finding the strength to walk away from toxic situations. Don't forget to subscribe and join our community so we can continue to support each other in building lives filled with respect, integrity, and genuine happiness. Your engagement means the world to me, and it helps ensure that stories like this reach the people who need them most. Remember that you are worth so much more than what you can do for people who don't truly see you.